Happy Monday, everyone. This is Martha with Nature Niche coming to you on location from Acadia National Park along the coast of Maine. This week, I'd like to share some of the beautiful landscapes from the summits of both Cadillac Mountain and Gorham Mountain in Acadia National Park, and share with you the Save Our Summits volunteer program. And this is a collaboration between the National Park Service, the Schoodic Institute, and Friends of Acadia. And it's focused on the restoration of native vegetation communities at the tops of mountains in the park. So the vegetation at these very popular hiking destinations often gets trampled, and between that and the windy, exposed nature of the site with the granite bedrock right at the surface, and then water washing soil away, these communities are hurting. And without the roots of the vegetation there to stabilize it, the soil washes away. And I just want to stress that that's why it's so important that when we're hiking in our national parks and on other public lands, why it's so important to stay on the designated trails. These parks get an awful lot of traffic, and we are loving them to the point of degradation. And we really need to be careful about that and mindful of the vegetation communities and the local wildlife that depend on them in these places. So this Save Our Summits program is an effort that enlists volunteers to carry soil up to the peaks to restoration sites. Many of these sites can only be accessed by foot. On Cadillac Mountain in the park, there's a road up, which makes it a little bit easier, but on Sargent and Penobscot summits, really foot trails is the only way to get soil up to these vegetation restoration sites. So this program locally sourced and sterilized soil. So the soil was heated to at least 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And this was to prevent the spread or introduction of invasive species and fungi with the movement of the soil. And basically without soil, there's no place for the summit vegetation, the seeds, to be able to establish and take root. So the movement of soil back to the tops of these summits is the goal of this particular program. It happens, at least in the past few years, it's been happening every Wednesday during the months of June through September. So if you're visiting or live nearby Acadia National Park, I encourage you to be a soil hero and consider hiking some soil up to the summits during those events. And in 2023, volunteers carried 3,765 pounds of soil to the summits to support restoration in 29 different eroded areas. So those are pretty impressive numbers, and amazing what we can do when we really put our mind to taking an active role in restoration. I want to talk a little bit more about human impact at Acadia National Park, and this is often true on a lot of our public lands. Both the vegetation is impacted both from trampling, invasive plant species getting introduced on people's shoes and equipment, and with human-caused climate change. So with that, there is a longer growing season being experienced. There are heavy rain events and longer drought periods in between these more intense rain events. There's less snow cover, and because of these things, a loss of native summit plants. The University of Maine's Climate Change Institute, in their studies, have shown that the Maine coast, the temperatures are increasing. Rain is coming in more intense storms, and the winter snowpack, which is important for insulation from wind and the desiccation of those winds, that snowpack is decreasing and becoming much more variable. So that makes plant life even more intense at the peaks of these mountains. The rocky terrain of these mountain summits are certainly beautiful, but they are degraded, and they need to have the thin soils be reestablished. Acadia's mountaintops have really diverse plant communities of over 145 different species, including grasses and ferns, sedges, mosses, lichens, wildflowers like downy goldenrod and New England aster and three-toothed cinquefoil, and stunted trees and shrubs like green and mountain alder, gray birch, balsam fir, boreal, and low sweet blueberries as examples. And it's really a unique mix of tough subalpine species that have evolved to tolerate variable and extreme weather conditions. They may be tough, but the situation that they're growing in is very fragile, with thin soils that are often, 1 inch or less thick, and these soil pockets are exposed to the wind and the rain and all the foot traffic. Cadillac Mountain gets over 500,000 visitors per year, and there have been tens of millions of visitors to this national park over the last couple of centuries, and that has dislodged a lot of the soil as people are taking in the breathtaking views. And I wanted to mention that Cadillac Mountain is part of the land originally occupied by the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn, and Cadillac held special meaning to them. It was known as the White Mountain of First Light, and many visitors come to this mountaintop to see the earliest sunrise along the East Coast. And Cadillac Mountain sits about 1,530 feet above sea level. And for example, the lichens and mosses that grow on the granite, they work at a time scale spanning a century or more. And so we really need active restoration to bring soil to these areas, because we've depleted the soil resources so quickly, and now really need to work to correct that situation. They've done studies, and just roping off the areas to keep the feet out isn't enough. There's been so much soil loss with the use of these areas that really we actively need to put soil back to be effective in the restoration efforts. So restoration of the mountain summits involves not only lugging soil uphill to these mountaintops, but groups like the Acadia staff, Friends of Acadia, the Native Plant Trust, and the Schoodic Institute have also experimented with planting seeds and native seedlings, and then using different kinds of erosion control blankets, coconut fiber-based erosion control materials, building berms to try to minimize storm water washing away soil, and using signage and physical barriers like roping off areas to help mitigate erosion and the trampling of restoration areas, and then also doing monitoring and weed removal. So there's a lot to these efforts, and there are a lot of scientific studies being conducted. Some to test if bringing plants in from many places, and especially warmer climates, will help make summit plant populations more resilient to climate change. And it sounds like they're being conservative with that, cutting off flowers from these plant whose genetics are not local, but from warmer areas, until they really understand if it helps or not. So trying to protect the native genetics and populations, and trying to understand how to make them more adaptable in the face of climate change. So they're using sites at different elevations where there's a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius temperature difference and moisture differences. So it tends to be getting warmer and is warmer at the summits versus mid-elevation locations, and cooler along the coastline where ocean currents and the moisture help moderate temperatures. So they're studying climate change by using different sites at different elevations, so they don't have to wait years for temperature shifts. They can kind of compare how the plants grow under these different conditions. There really I couldn't find a lot of discussion of the results yet. I think they're still gathering data, but they're hoping to inform restoration efforts and help those efforts be most effective. So a very scientific approach to the restoration on these summits. And one of the focuses is to reestablish stoloniferous spreading plants, so plants that put out runners above ground stems to help spread. A good example is 3-toothed cinquefoil, which helps hold the soil. It has runners and then roots at the nodes, and it helps other plants establish by its evergreen, a good spreader, and it helps create a stable turf with grasses and lichens and mosses to offer up a place for other things like alders to get established. There are also tests being done or experiments where they're adding mosses and lichens to plantings to help hold the soil and help retain moisture in the soil during drought periods. And there are studies of seeded versus just soil added plots. So that those are showing no statistical difference. So basically, if you bring the soil, the plants will find a way to establish from nearby sources, and that extra effort of adding native seed seems to be unnecessary, at least at this point. So that's good news for the speed of these restoration projects and plant establishment. The Cadillac Summit Restoration, they have added a number of species. Just for example, things like balsam fir, mountain alder, Nantucket shadbush, which is an Amelanchier species, bearberry, black chokeberry, gray birch, poverty oatgrass, lance-leaf goldenrod, ground juniper, red spruce, lowbush blueberry, New England aster, downy goldenrod, and meadowsweet. So those of us from Michigan hopefully recognize some of those common names. There is a fair bit of overlap. And those are species that are part of these restoration efforts. I hope you've enjoyed the images that I've shared as fall was just starting to set in Acadia as we were visiting, and that hearing about the Save Our Summits volunteer-based program, restoration program, really makes you stop and think about, when you're in these places, staying on the trails, staying on the bedrock, avoiding those fragile, thin soil areas that the summit plants depend upon. And think about where you're standing as you're angling to get that perfect shot of the view. Make sure you also stop to look down and appreciate the diverse vegetation that really is toughing it out on these summits that often feel the impacts of climate change first. And I hope it encourages you to actively participate in ecological restoration efforts wherever it is that you live. And another thing that I saw on the signage, educational signage throughout the park, talked about planting natives and doing a climate smart restoration in your own landscape. So I definitely encourage you to consider that as well. Take care and have a good week.